The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Don't call it a midlife crisis. A boat is a perfectly sound investment, and this was a real beauty. 36 feet of pure white fiberglass hull with an interior flooring of varnished teak and a closed-loop fuel system feeding 400 horses all at once. Whole setup running so smooth. It was like a cat purring at you, and all amenities included, for two lucky lovebirds to travel in style. Sure, there was only me at the moment. Charlotte had left a while ago, taking the kids with her. Fuck her. I'd put myself out there. Find someone else. I'd just work on my tan for a while. First, maybe drop a few pounds. Plenty of time for that. What I couldn't wait to do was to take my new baby out for a spin. I knew boats. We'd had one when I was a kid. Fine memories of family vacations. Sun beating down as I dried out on deck after my third swim of the day. Great stuff. And I got to steer the thing too. Sometimes, that's how I knew this was not going to be a problem. So easy. A kid could do it. I didn't get lost. Exactly. I had the GPS. It told me which way was which, and how to get back home, even though it did insist there was an island right next to me. And there wasn't. And I had the radio. I could call for help. No worries. Since everything was obviously all good, I decided to enjoy myself. Nothing but open ocean meant perfect privacy, and maybe this was just what I needed, a little R&R. In any case, the boat was fully stocked. No time like the present to take advantage of it. I went below deck to get a Bollinger out of the fridge. I considered filling a bucket with ice and getting out a glass, but then I thought, who cares? Salt life. Baby. Popping the cork, I took a big swig. Who says money can't buy happiness? Going back out on deck, I admired the view. Life was so good, clad in nothing but my bathing shorts. I was on a beautiful boat with cool blue water lapping against the hull and gulping down champagne like it was nothing. Anyone out there who wouldn't want to be me right now? That's what I'd like to know. I Saturday down in the captain's seat, putting my feet up on the dash. I took another swig. I tapped my fingers on my leg. I got bored. This sucked. The sun was too hot. I was getting hungry, too. Of course, there was plenty of food on board, but I didn't feel like cooking anything. I remembered there was an all-day buffet back at the marina, and that realization tore it. Sitting up in the chair and tucking the still cool bottle between my thighs, I flipped the key in the ignition. It spectacularly failed to achieve anything. I turned the key back. I flipped it again. Same result. God damn it, I swore, then glanced vaguely upwards and muttered a quick sorry while crossing myself. Old habits from Catholic school die hard, and if Sister Agnes had been here now, a busted engine would have been the least of my problems. I stood up, clasping the bottle, not knowing what to do. I was no mechanic. Were there even any tools on board? I had a sinking feeling that the only way I'd be getting my hands on a screwdriver was by mixing vodka with some orange juice. I took another drink. All the joy of it had vanished now, and the bubbles only tasted sour. Petulantly, I spun around and hurled the bottle away from me in the same motion. My eyes going wide, I watched in horror as it perfectly struck the forehead of the young woman who had just been hauling herself over the gunwale. Half in the boat and half out, she clung there with a dazed expression that slowly went cross-eyed. Then, grip slackening as her body went limp, she began to slide back towards the water. Instinct made me leap forward to grab hold of her. I got her just in time, and grasping her under the arms, managed to flop her onto the deck. Jesus, I was muttering. Jesus, Jesus. This didn't count as blasphemy, right? I was asking for help more than anything else. Her head was bleeding freely. I still carried some muscle from my football days, and I'd gotten her really good. Was she dead? Please, dear God, don't let her be dead. I put a hand to her throat to feel for a pulse, and a warm sense of pure relief flowed through me when I felt a beat. Slow, but steady. Picking her up like a child, I began carrying her below deck. No way could I leave her out there in the baking sun, so the bed would be the best place for her. It did occur to me now that she was completely naked, dripping wet, and naked. Where the hell had she come from? Was there another boat? I put her gently down and draped a sheet over her for the sake of modesty. Then I hurried back out and scanned the horizon in every direction. Nothing. I wished I'd brought a pair of binoculars, but probably it wouldn't have made any difference. Laser eye surgery had left me with 20/20 vision, and everywhere I looked, there was nothing but the sea. I shook my head. This was too much. First my boat had broken down, and now a skinny dipper appeared out of nowhere to bleed all over my Egyptian cotton. I had to get on the radio and call for help. The one smart thing I'd done before heading out was to familiarize myself with the handheld VHF. The thing had a built-in GPS that would automatically transmit my position, and it didn't take me long to get in contact with a rescue vessel. It was a stroke of pure luck, but they were returning from what had proved to be a false alarm, and had no problem redirecting themselves to pick us up. When I explained about the presence of an unconscious woman with a head wound, it really seemed to light a fire under their asses too. When I turned around, the unconscious woman in question was sitting up in the bed. I froze, looking at her. She looked back. Her eyes were shockingly dark, as if the pupils had fully dilated. She fixed me with a gaze of such intensity, I wanted to look away, yet I didn't dare to break eye contact for a second. You see, the sheet had slipped down around her waist, and her small breasts were on full display. It shouldn't have mattered. I'd seen all there was to see out there on the deck, and touched her too, when I carried her down here. But somehow the sheen of the purple bedclothes around her were emphasizing her nakedness, turning it from a natural state and into something lecherous. I wished I'd gotten the plain white sheets now. I realized, who did I even think I was? Some porn star. Are you all right? I finally managed. She touched her forehead, licked blood from her fingers. My head hurts, she said slowly. Her accent was unfamiliar to me. Russian, I thought. Eastern Europe somewhere. Long way from home. If so, yeah, I said. I'm real sorry about that. I didn't see you. I chuckled nervously. I mean, where did you even come from? She sniffed, looking around at the interior of the cabin without seeming much impressed. I swam, because boats always. She was making no sense, trailing off in the middle of her sentence. The blow to the head must have really done a number on her. I silently prayed there would be no brain damage, and offered to attend church every Sunday for a full year as payment for it. You should let me look at that cut there, I said. I'll clean it up. I was already scrambling for the first aid kit. Something had cracked when I hit her, but was it her head or was it the bottle? I knew more or less what I was doing when it came to the basics, but I was worried this would be beyond me. Didn't matter. I'd do what I could, and the rest would just have to wait. Sitting down on the bed, I put the little red and white satchel next to me and began getting out some gauze and a small bottle of saline solution. This might, I began. I was going to say sting a little, when her hand snaked out to grab my wrist. I instinctively tried to pull away, and found I couldn't. God, but she was strong. She leaned into me. I saw her nostrils flare. Was she smelling me? Hey, I said. I was stammering a bit. Gently. I tried to extricate myself, but it was no use. Instead, I found myself being pulled forward. I noticed for the first time that her teeth were surprisingly bad. Snaggly and yellowish, cute otherwise, and not as young as I'd thought at first. Late 20s perhaps. Just very skinny. And acting weird. Concussion, I decided. Had to be. What was the procedure with that? Keep them awake. Play along. Like my cologne? I asked. You smell nice. Too. Driftwood and kelp. The bold new scent by Saint Laurent. I realized I was babbling. My wrist was starting to hurt. She seemed intent on planting a kiss on my shoulder. Despite my attempts at dissuading her, she'd almost put her mouth to the trembling flesh when she winced, her hand releasing me to gingerly prod at her forehead again. She looked at me. "You would mend me." I'd pulled myself back a little as soon as she let go. I was entirely in two minds about things. Part of me thought the cabin seemed suddenly very cramped. It wanted to place itself out of reach of those slender arms with their vice-like grip. Another part wanted only to help her. It was so clear she needed me. What kind of shithead would I be if I just ignored that? This was kind of my fault. "Sure," I said. "I'll take care of it. Just stay still now. Don't grab." Slowly, I dabbed away most of the blood and cleaned the wound out as best I could. It wasn't all that bad, I thought. If I didn't know any better, I'd say it had almost begun to heal already. Head wounds were supposed to bleed a lot too, weren't they? Maybe I'd gotten worked up over nothing. Though she had passed out for a moment, and that probably wasn't good. Carefully, I slightly increased the pressure on her brow, just to feel for any sign of something being broken. No, everything still felt fine. It was just the first momentary panic that had made me think otherwise. All right, there was also some aloe gel in the kit. That was good for wounds, right? Couldn't hurt. I squeezed a small dollop onto my fingers and very gently began to massage it into her forehead. She had closed her eyes halfway through my ministrations, and now she was sighing contently. Her mouth curved slightly. "That's nice," she said. "I like that. Good. Great. I'm gonna put a bandage on you now. Okay?" Before I could get that far, the handheld crackled into life. "Cherry Bomb. Come in, Cherry Bomb. This is Sunbeam. We are approaching your location now. Please respond. Over." Yeah. I named my boat Cherry Bomb. So what? Sue me for liking the Runaways. "You stay here, okay?" I told my guest. "Rest. I'm going up on deck, but I'll be right back." I grabbed the handheld and hurried out. Out on the deck, the ocean breeze did wonders for clearing my head. I hadn't realized just how on edge I was. Shading my eyes against the sun, I could see the shape of a boat out there now, rapidly approaching. "Sunbeam, this is Cherry Bomb. We are, standing by for rescue. Over." "Roger that, Cherry Bomb. We are prepared to offer immediate medical assistance. Is the patient capable of being moved?" "Over." "Actually," I said, "I don't think we'll need..." There were footsteps behind me. I turned to look and let go of the call button. "I feel better now," she said. She stood there, naked and completely unashamed. "I remember why I came here." She moved towards me, slowly. Her lips were parted slightly, and I thought her tongue darted quickly out to lick them. Then her eyes shifted to a point above my shoulder. "Boat," she said. "Coming to get you." "Yeah," I said. "Us. It's all gonna be okay." Now, I had taken a step backwards. I realized the way she'd been looking at me. She seemed to consider something. "Made me feel good," she murmured. "When you touched me." She'd come so close we could almost have kissed. Gently, she placed her hands on my chest. "But," she said, "I'm also hungry." She gave me a shove so hard and fast, I didn't even have time to yell before going over the side. The water slapped my back like a giant's hand and I went under, then came back up, spluttering. From the deck, she looked down at me. "I like you," she shouted. "I will give you a head start, okay? If you make it to the other boat, you can leave." I was about to ask her what the hell she was playing at, but she had already leapt from the deck, curving forward to perform a perfect dive. She knifed into the water and changed. Her speed had carried her deep beneath the surface, but I could still see her well enough to know it wasn't her anymore. Scales glittered on a blue-grey and sinuous body that snaked around and coiled upon itself. A woman's torso grew from the lower body of a giant eel. A pair of eyes like dark marbles blinked as a nightmare mouth split open. Screaming, I thrashed and flailed, made for the ladder of my boat. I had to get out of the water. The shape came shooting up so quickly it almost seemed to simply appear before me. It cut me off, pushed me back, herding me away. A webbed hand slid across my belly in passing, grating like sandpaper against my skin. A message delivered. Don't go that way. I reversed, kicking, threw myself around and turning my momentum into a desperate and inelegant crawl as I began to swim for my life in the direction of the approaching rescue vessel. This wasn't happening. This wasn't possible. She wasn't. A stab of pain in my left thigh. Something flashed past me in the water, circled round and came up again from behind me. I whimpered, swallowed seawater, floundered, threw myself forward again. It was below me now. I could feel it. Caught flashes of reflected light. At first I'd been praying, begging, please, please, please don't let it get me. God and Sister Agnes help me now, and I will always be so good forever, I promise. But even that babble of childish fear and pleading had stilled, displaced by a deeper terror, some atavistic instinct that screamed at me shark. And beneath that, even purer and more thoroughly imprinted in the memory of my DNA, was simply the image of teeth. I wasn't a man. I was prey. Like prey. I fled. A touch of ice against my foot. A red line drawn across my chest. A nip. A prod. A cut and something vital leaking out of me. Then nothing. I crashed on through the waves, heedless of anything but the need to escape. A wall loomed in front of me. Trapped! Trapped! Gibbering with panic. I tried to turn, but strong arms were already gripping me, hauling me up, out of the water. I became aware of frantic voices surrounding me on all sides. Got you, buddy. Hang on! Shit. What was that? Jesus, you're torn up. Why the hell did you jump? We were coming right to you! The girl. Where's the girl? Anyone see the girl? I couldn't give them any answers. Already I was slipping into unconsciousness. As it was, the paramedic they had standing by on the sunbeam came in pretty handy after all. I was missing 3 toes on my left foot and bleeding from a dozen other wounds. The cut across my chest had sliced away a nipple and otherwise left a long and ugly scar that swelled up purple and never really flattened out. They looked for her for as long as they could, but of course there was no sign of anyone else. Shark must have gotten her. Weren't supposed to be any man-eaters around here, but sometimes they travel and end up in unexpected places, so I was assured. Anyway, of course there were other questions. Who was she? What had happened between us on my boat? I could have gotten in some pretty bad trouble over that, but it all worked out in the end. After all, the crew of the Sunbeam had been watching through binoculars, had caught me going into the water. Then they'd seen the girl jump in after me. All of her own free will. After that, things did get somewhat confused, but I knew to keep my mouth shut about it until I had several very expensive lawyers by my side. Money, money, money. What can't it do? Well, it can't get rid of the nightmares. I drink myself to sleep now, most nights. It's not the pain of my missing pieces or the jumbled images from my panicked swim that go through my head, but something else that happened afterwards, when we'd given up the search. Everyone else were busy, one man working to stitch up my leg, but I was awake and looking back, sitting propped up against an equipment chest. I saw her, out in the sea. She was bobbing very peacefully, only the humanish part of her torso visible above water. Our eyes met, flashing me a needle grin. She cheerfully waved a webbed hand in goodbye. Then she dove and disappeared beneath the surface. The call rang in at 7:42. I had just begun that day's closing operations, silently thanking God for another day of lackluster work. It's not every day that there's a missing child or a murdered spouse. And to be quite frank, I like to keep it that way, most days. Like today, were calls of wrong numbers or the occasional missing dog. Today, Paul Jordan's boy, Kieran, called to tell us his cat ran from home. When we arrived, A very apologetic Paul and tearful Kieran informed us the cat had simply passed away the night before. As such, on a day like today, you don't expect the phone to change your life. I placed the cell to my ear and was greeted by an unfamiliar voice. "Hello," it stated, barely audible. "Sheriff's office. What can I do for you?" I responded, placing a cigarette into my mouth. Oh, I called the right number. The woman on the other end sounded 20 at the oldest. Her breath shook heavily, as though she had just run a mile and a half in the dead of winter. I could hardly make out her words behind the heavy pattering of rain. She sounded quite surprised to get a hold of me, and I was quite surprised I didn't know who she was. Lawrence had a population of 1,200, and I'd spoken to just about all of them. "I suppose you did. What kind of work do you folks do?" I paused, trying to remember if I truly had answered the phone the way I did. I suppose she took my silence as a confirmation of what she suspected, as she continued. "I'm the new caretaker for Mr. and Mrs. Mulligan. You know, Tom and Esther." Right, sorry. Mrs. Mulligan is in some sort of bad way, and we need her examined." I glance at the clock. 7:45. I think you should call a doctor. Then, Loran is... I've already called Dr. Willows. She cut me off. She won't go back. This statement gave me pause. Doctor. Loran Willows was a great friend of the Mulligans, being that she was the only medical doctor in town. She likely knew more folks than I did. I knew that if Esther was in bad sorts, she'd want to help in any way possible. "Right," I said finally. "What's happening?" "I'm not sure how to describe it. Mrs. Mulligan, she won't die." I paused again, unsure if I had heard her correctly. I had thought, perhaps, that this young woman had signed up to be a caretaker for one, not two. Maybe she didn't want to care for Esther, and had slipped in her words. "Well, that's wonderful." I chuckled slightly. "I assure you it's not. Sir, please, you need to come as quickly as you can." The phone call was disconnected before I could respond. I figured, with hesitation, that even if I didn't go on the business of the call, a wellness check was clearly in order. I called over my partner, John Lewis, and told him to put on his coat. "Where are we off to?" "My shift is over in 10, John whined. "Mine too," I sighed. "We're going to the Mulligans." "Why's that?" he questioned, seeming less concerned with his punch cards. "Wellness check," I said, opening the front door of the sheriff's office. "Their new caretaker is, John probed. She's, worried about Esther." I decided not to mention the fact that this new maid, whatever her name was, seemed suspiciously infatuated with the death of an old woman. John had grown up in this town, unlike me, and was surely even more concerned about the Mulligans than I was. As we arrived at the old home, it was in a horrible state of disrepair. The driveway was cracked and laden with all sorts of odd materials. Fire axes, a disconnected garden hose, an open bear trap and more lay haphazardly around the front yard. One of the downstairs windows was busted, covered by a blue tarp from the outside. The walkway to the front steps had been flooded by the heavy downpour that was still raging violently, and we couldn't see any lights on in the house. Whoever this caretaker was, she wasn't very good at her job. "Christ," John bellowed, taking me out of my trance. "Put it down, Thomas." I swung my head in the direction he was yelling. Outside, in the pouring rain, stood Thomas Mulligan. He was sitting half upright against a tree with a shotgun in his hands, pointed directly at John and I. "Mr. Mulligan," I, too, shouted. "We're here to check on Esther. We don't want your help." "Creeper," he yelled, pointed the shotgun dead at me. Or you either fatso." I glanced over at John, who seemed both upset that he wasn't recognized and that his childhood neighbor just insulted him. I placed my hands out and motioned for Thomas to put down the shotgun that was now pointed back at John. "Mr. Mulligan, I'm Officer Grayson, I said slowly and firmly. And this is Officer Lewis. You know me, Thomas. It's me, John, my partner interjected, his voice quaking. At that, Mr. Mulligan lowered his shotgun, and the three of us let out a simultaneous sigh of relief. We approached the tree Mr. Mulligan was leaning against, and he raised his shotgun once more. No, please, Mr. Mulligan yelled, more fearful than agitated now. You don't want to. You. Mr. Mulligan's voice was cut off by the sound of the front door to the house swinging open with a loud crash. The silhouette of a frail young woman stepped onto the front porch. Are you the officers I called? The woman shouted as loud as she could, but was still hardly audible. Yes, ma'am, I replied. Are you aware that Thomas is out here in the rain with a loaded weapon? I haven't been able to get him to come back inside, she replied, approaching us weakly. I noticed she had a slight limp in her walk, and her right arm hung limply at her side. She was impossibly thin, with dinner plate-sized eyes and straight brown hair. Well, Miss, John stated, passing glances between her and Mr. Mulligan. Olivia Newman, she said quietly. Miss Newman, I'm not going to tell you how to do your job, but Thomas is your responsibility. We need to get him inside. Oh, don't blame her, Jack, Mr. Mulligan said hoarsely. I might be old, but I can still make my own decisions. I chose to come out here, and out here is where I'm staying. I kneeled down to meet Mr. Mulligan at eye level. He was bleeding, but I couldn't tell where over the rain. He was equally as emaciated as Miss Newman, like the pair hadn't eaten in weeks. His clothes were ill-fitted and torn, and he had a 1,000-yard stare like I'd never seen on another human being before. What happened here, Mr. Mulligan? I asked softly. His eyes drifted subtly away from mine as he began to speak. Olivia didn't tell you? It's, oh, God, she won't die. Kid, who won't die? Thomas. Mr. Mulligan looked me dead in my eyes. He smiled and spoke uncharacteristically calmly. Son, promise me something, he whimpered, gazing back at the house. If you send her to hell, tell her I said I was sorry the Lord couldn't take her where I'm going. With that, Thomas Mulligan, aged 85, went completely limp. His eyes had an unchanged soullessness, as though he died long ago. His smile faded, and the shotgun fell onto the driveway with a loud clatter. I stood up solemnly. Miss Newman began to scream, and John had the same exact stare Mr. Mulligan had just given me. I'm real sorry, John, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. You've seen enough for tonight. Go home and hug your dad. Man. John shrugged my hand off his shoulder. Someone has to call in the body, he said. I didn't argue with him, as I still had to tend to Miss Newman and locate Mrs. Mulligan. I hung my head, sighed, and turned to Miss Newman. She was gently shaking Mr. Mulligan's body and sobbing uncontrollably. I placed my hand on her shoulder and gave her the warmest look I could muster at that moment. Olivia, I said, we should probably go check on Esther. Olivia said nothing. She turned back to Mr. Mulligan's body and did not move. I stood with her a moment, then headed toward the front door. I still had a job to do. The inside of the house was even more disgusting than the outside. Piles of dirtied clothes, spilled pill bottles, and rotting food covered the living room. The main stairs were missing half of the steps, and the banister was splintered in several directions. I held my breath as I carefully ascended the stairs, fearing more with each step that I would fall through them entirely. The upstairs was equally as unpleasant, peeling wallpaper and black mold all over the walls. The carpet was stained and matted, and a dog food bowl, labeled Pommy, was overflowing with canned meat. At the far end of the hall laid a single, strangely pristine bedroom door. A sense of dread hit me instantly as I approached the door. I suddenly became quite aware that I was alone, that there was nobody else on the way. I knew I was about to see either an emaciated old woman who I knew personally, or a dead body I knew that there was byway anyone would hear me scream over the rain and thunder outside. I knew that if Olivia made her way back inside, she would find me too. I knew John would have to go looking for me if I didn't come back. "Mrs. Mulligan," I shouted. Nobody answered. "Esther, this is Officer Sam Grayson. I'm with the police. Is everything all right?" There was still no response. "Esther, I'm gonna come in." "Okay." I twisted the doorknob hesitantly and pushed it open. As soon as I did, a small Yorkshire Terrier bolted out of the room. I watched him run down the stairs and out of the house, like he hadn't left that room his whole life. He was well groomed, fit, and generally looked more cared for than either of the human residents I had met. Inside the room, there was a single wooden chair on its side directly in the middle. An empty noose hung from the ceiling. As I shone my flashlight on the room, I realized it was completely tidy. There was no indication it had been connected to the rest of the house as it lay empty. There was a small vase with healthy flowers in it. The bed was made and tucked, and the television was softly broadcasting the news. "Oh my, hello, officer." I swung around as quickly as I could. Behind me, in the doorway, stood Esther Mulligan. She was as I remembered her, short, well-fed, and with a sweet glow about her. She gave me a comforting smile and walked past me with a large basket of dirty, mildewy clothes. "I heard about my dear Thomas," she said, almost giggling. "Shame he didn't come back in the house." She began folding the clothes and did not look at me. She either didn't notice or didn't care that the clothes were completely unsalvageable. "You did, though, didn't you?" She smiled, gesturing for me to sit next to her on the edge of the bed. I approached slowly, picking up the turned-over chair in the middle of the room. "Oh, that was a fun one," she said cheerfully, pointing at the noose. "Tried to hang myself. Doesn't feel nearly as uncomfortable as you'd think, with the right kind of rope. Naturally." I cautiously sat down beside her and opened my mouth to speak. Nothing came out. "You know," she said, "I heard little Jack was an officer now. Is he downstairs?" No, ma'am," I managed to squeak out. "Ah, well, beggars can't be choosers, can they?" She placed a wrinkly, shaking hand on my thigh. "Olivia wasn't my first choice either. Mind you, we've gone through a lot of caretakers these past few months. You, though." Esther looked me up and down and pointed toward my gun holster. "I won't say we haven't tried it," she remarked, "but would you humor me?" I placed my hand on my gun, having every intention of it staying holstered. I shook my head slowly, unsure if words would come out if I tried. Well," Esther said sadly, "I'd say you were free to leave, but Thomas and Olivia didn't fare so well, did they?" She stood up slowly and motioned for me to follow her, against my better judgment. I kept a reasonable distance and followed her. She led me carefully around piles of food, trash, and laundry until we landed at the front door. "Quickly now, before it closes again," she remarked, stepping outside of the house. As soon as I joined her back onto the front porch, the door slammed closed on its own. Outside lay the bodies of Thomas Mulligan, Olivia Newman, and that little dog. The dog was now as unkempt and skinny as the other two corpses, like it had rotted away as soon as it crossed the threshold of the front door. John was noticeably absent. The car was still there, but had nobody inside of it. "Little time to waste," Esther said, stepping over the little Yorkie. She stood in the middle of the driveway and held her arms out to her sides. "Try to see if you can do what they couldn't, Officer Grayson." I had no idea what she meant by that. My focus was clear on the bodies outside. When did Olivia pass? How did the dog die? What the hell was going on? Where the hell was John? I'm not sure how to describe what happened next. One moment I was focused solely on the bodies of the deceased, and the next, I had my gun in my hands and a bullet in the old woman. It was as if she had completely removed my free will, like she wanted her ending to go exactly as she planned, and didn't want me mulling it over too long. Esther laid on the grass, emaciated and unwashed, with a bullet in her head. Just as I had started to approach her, I felt a sharp pain in my left shoulder. I grabbed my shoulder and fell to the ground. As soon as I hit the floor, the rain had stopped. I was bleeding heavily, and John was standing over me. The bodies of the Mulligans laid across the yard, fully healthy, fully washed, fully lifelike. John was screaming at me, but I couldn't figure out what he was trying to tell me. Something about whether I had gone insane, what the hell I was thinking, why the hell I would harm that old woman. I tried to tell him she wanted me to, that I had no choice, but he wouldn't listen to me. Just as he was getting ready to put me into custody, the house began to shake. The entire building creaked and whined for 30 seconds. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The building was back to normal, as though nobody had ever been inside of it. One by one, the Mulligans began to sit up, brush off their clothes, and head back inside. "Thanks for trying, officers," Olivia said sadly. "We'll probably see you again in a few weeks. Mrs. Mulligan can't help it." And with that, she closed the front door and locked it. John quit the force about a week after that call. They never did call again, at least not that I was ever made aware of. As far as I knew, life went back to normal for everyone but John and I. We agreed it would be best to not mention to anyone what happened. We didn't want anyone to go through what we had. I had all but completely repressed this memory over the last few years, but last week I was called back to the house. The entire building had burst into flames, with all 3 of its inhabitants presumed dead. I didn't register that it was the same house where it all happened until, when looking for the deceased, I found a partially melted dog bowl labeled Pommy. No bodies were ever recovered from that house. It sits empty now, ready to be demolished. There was no family that ever claimed the property, and nobody ever reported anyone named Olivia Newman living in the home at all. As far as anyone can recall, the Mulligans lived alone, without the need for a caretaker. Even John is starting to forget the details of that night. And I'm afraid I will too. I'm writing this down in case anyone has any information on Olivia Newman or the fire in Lawrence, Washington. If you know anything, please contact me. I might not remember this story soon, so please be as timely as possible. I'm well aware how ludicrous this story may sound, and I don't blame anyone for calling bullshit, but this is kind of my final message to the outside world, so bear with me for a little bit. I'm an outdoorsy kind of guy. I always have been. As a kid, I liked wandering around in nature. I liked the peace and quiet that comes with it. The sounds of nature calm my soul. I really just love being outside. Being an adult and living in the city makes that a bit harder, for many reasons. So I constantly yearn for the outdoors. And a couple of weeks ago, I got fired. For unfair reasons, of course. Just because I'm not always as happy as can be to customers, and I tend to get lost in daydreaming. That doesn't mean you can just fire me, right? Anyway, after the upsetting news reached me, I was, well, upset. I still needed a job, like most people do, and finding employment is so hard, especially as of recently. So, to combat the feelings of sadness and annoyance, I decided I deserved a little break, at least before looking for another job. You can probably imagine what my idea of a break was. Being cooped up inside a tiny, sweaty, and overall horrible fast food building every day made me sick of being surrounded by walls. Even my own apartment was too oppressive for me. So I organized a weekend camping trip with a few friends. My 2 closest friends, Francis and Haley, accepted and told me they'd be there. It doesn't matter that nobody else agreed. Shut up. Those 2 did, and that was good enough. We decided we'd get to our starting point on Friday afternoon and set up camp for a night or 2. Being recently unemployed, I got there early and had to sit on my own for way too long. Random hikers walked back and forth along the trail, glaring at me as they passed. I stared at my feet after a while. Those people staring at me. Psh, what do they know? When my friends finally did arrive, they arrived late. I yelled at them for taking so long and leaving me to be judged by random strangers. They were like 4 or 5 minutes late after all. Haley was apparently a fake friend because she yelled insults back at me and just left. Whatever, I decided. Francis looked tired already. so I ushered him to the trail before he could decide he hated me too. The hike was about half an hour each way, and I talked at Francis about my running streak of bad luck pretty much the whole way there, aside from a little shit-talking people in my life who piss me off. He must have had a bad day at work that day because he was quiet and really irritable. I don't get why people are all about employment and jobs and stuff. So overrated, to be honest. Eventually, we made it to the camping spot, super far off the main trail, past the huge brambles and the giant chain-link fence. Was the best place for camping ever. The warnings and keep-out signs only make it better. Francis was annoyingly quiet the whole time and kept looking behind him and being jumpy and stuff, which I didn't appreciate. The one thing he kept saying was that this place wasn't meant for camping and that it wasn't a good idea and blah blah blah. It was like he wanted to ruin my trip. I ignored him whenever he mentioned it. After the walk, we made it to a small clearing surrounded by dense trees where we stopped to set up camp. Francis continued being a whiny bitch, talking about being followed or watched or whatever. I told him exactly what I thought, that he was being a whiny bitch, and he finally stopped bringing the mood down. I set up my tent and he followed shortly after. Failing as he did, I couldn't help but sit back, watch and laugh. When he finally put it together, I made a fire for us and we toasted marshmallows and I made s'mores as the sun started to set. All the while, Francis silently looked around nervously, ignoring the fact that his marshmallow was completely charred. I didn't understand why he was so paranoid. I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. Francis went to bed pretty quickly and told me I was crazy for staying out. I stayed out until the fire died down to prove a point. I enjoyed the alone time anyway. He was such a wimp sometimes. I did go to bed eventually, feeling frustrated at the general mood of the day. I fell asleep pretty quickly though. The next day, I woke up at the crack of dawn to Francis whispering at me through the tent. He was rambling at me for a while before I took any of his words in. "So can we please go now?" was the first thing I registered. "What?"
No!
"You fucking pussy. I thought you liked camping," I said groggily. He stayed silent for a while. "Not here. Man, this place is fucked. We have to get out of here." Psh! What a chump, right? "Man, go by yourself then, if you're such a wimp," I retorted. I said I don't know the way. "Tom, did you listen to anything I said?" "Nope," I admitted. He sighed in defeat. Man, Haley was right. And with that, he crawled back into his tent. I didn't need him to have a good time here anyway. It didn't take too long until I was up after that. I ate some breakfast and picked up my backpack and went to wander around the clearing, taking in the scenery. The breeze gently blew through the trees around me. The warm air soothed the tension I had built up, and the distant chirps and chitters of animals put my mind at ease. It really was perfect. I strolled around the clearing, picked some flowers, mushrooms and berries and stuff, some of which I'd never seen anywhere else before. There was literally nothing to be worried about anywhere. Francis was overreacting for sure. As I was appreciating the nature, though, I thought I saw a flash of movement, deep within the woods. Walking over to investigate, I noticed a really faint path winding through the dense trees, leading the opposite direction of where we came from. The movement must have come from there. I got that little jump in my stomach, where you feel like you're exploring or discovering something secret. I was immediately entranced, and without hesitation, started on the path. It was hard to follow. Several times I lost the vague direction and had to backtrack slightly to find it again. I figured it must have been a deer trail, all windy and confusing to follow. You know, how deers like to traverse. I didn't stop to look around until I walked face first into a branch and fell over. I don't know how I did. It felt like it almost came at me and slapped me, but when I looked up, the trees were different. Diseased, I guess. They looked gross and eerie. The leaves blocking almost all light from above made it unnaturally dark. It felt like they were all looking down at me. To be honest, I felt kind of scared. Helpless, as pathetic as it sounds. I snapped out of my trance, got up, and looked around for the trail. My heart rate spiked when I couldn't find it at first, and it kept rising when I looked harder, and I still couldn't find it. Frantically glancing around, I couldn't see anything but vile, twisting trees surrounding me. Were they getting closer? No. I was freaking myself out. Pull yourself together. Man, I had to say to myself. I was turned around after the fall and decided to pick a direction and stick to it. I would get out eventually. Squeezing past trees I didn't have to before. I set off. After at least, like an hour, probably more, nothing was changing. Everything I could see looked at least vaguely familiar. I was panicking, not to mention starving. These weird, gross trees went on forever. I must have picked the wrong direction. I was sweating a shit ton and running at this point. I was so tired. At some point, I caught my foot on a root, or something, and fell flat on my face. Yet when I looked, I couldn't see anything I could have tripped over. Finally admitting defeat, I decided to try and yell for Francis. The first time, there was no response. A little louder. Nothing. Louder still. Nothing. Still. The woods felt suffocating and I felt like a caged animal, even if I was technically outside still. Now I really was scared. As if on cue, a gentle voice sounded from behind me. I yelped in surprise and whipped my head around, and Francie, a tall, beautiful woman, who seemed to light the surroundings up slightly, stood above me, taller than me. Her skin was incredibly pale. She had long, wavy and shiny black hair that seemed to shimmer despite the dark. She gazed at me with piercing, icy blue eyes and wore only a spotless, bright white dress that, along with her hair, flowed like they were underwater. I looked on in awe for a moment before responding. Sorry, what did you say? I tentatively asked her. She had a very dignified presence. It commanded respect, in a way. I said, "Are you lost?" Her voice was surprisingly deep and smooth as butter. It made me feel like I was melting. Yes, I am, as it happens. I don't know why I became so nervous after she spoke. I felt honored to be in her presence. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked me, in an almost motherly tone, sending a shiver down my spine. Tom. I'm Tom, and yourself?" "Follow me, Tom," she said as she turned to leave. I didn't question that she ignored me. I had to follow her. To get out of here, yes, but also because I was already head over heels for her. I jumped to my feet and ran behind her, suddenly reinvigorated. She looked as if she was gliding through the woods, like she knew this unending landscape like the back of her hand. She elegantly, yet playfully, danced her way around the trees as she led me away from that nightmare. I kept my eyes fixed on her, noticing that she was always the same distance away, no matter how fast I ran. I followed her for some time. I don't know how long. I was almost entranced by her, but by the time I caught up with her, my legs felt like jelly. "Here we are," she basically whispered to me. It was dark, but the full moon hung high in the sky, casting a ghostly bluish glow all around the clearing. "Wow, thank you. How did you do that?" I was slightly in disbelief. She only giggled at my question, but who was I to argue? She delicately caressed my cheek and slid her finger down to my chin. Her touch was soft, softer than any material I'd felt, yet it had a fiery heat that felt like it burnt my skin. "You must have realized by now," she whispered directly in my ear this time. "This place is not for you. You mustn't stay." Her breath was somehow cold on my neck. She let go of me as another shiver went down my spine. This time I felt slightly threatened by her. "Yeah, sorry about that," I said without looking at her. Thinking back to the signs earlier, there was no response. I looked up to speak to her. But she was gone by that point, though it felt like she was still here. Her presence lingered in the air somehow. "Damn it." "Nice one, Tom," I said aloud. It was late by that point and I was utterly exhausted. I walked past Francis's tent, admiring the serenity of the night, and into mine, where I passed right out once I lay down. I woke up the next morning, feeling wrong. I guess sleeping fully clothed doesn't help, but it was more than that. A certain emptiness lingered deep inside me. I tried to brush it off and got up. I was absolutely starving, so I ate the rest of the food in my bag that was meant for at least another couple days. I was still kinda hungry though, so I left my tent and went to Francis. "Francis?" No response. Francis. Still nothing, Francis. Still nothing. "Welp, this is on you," I said as I quickly unzipped the tent. He wasn't there, though, which was weird. But whatever. I rummaged through his stuff and ate anything edible, not really able to control myself. The empty feeling lingered inside me, even after all that food. I decided to look for the lady again, feeling strangely compelled to. After all, I didn't have much else to do, and she was pretty awesome, even just to listen to. I still didn't know her name, so I yelled aimlessly into the trees from the day before, mainly shouting "lady" over and over. Surprisingly, it did work. "What are you still doing here?" Her voice echoed from behind me. It was harsh and cold this time. I spun around, but she wasn't there. I turned back around and jumped at the sight of her. She was somehow right in front of me. "Hey, The words died in my throat and my mouth went dry as I looked up at her. She wasn't smiling like the day before. Her gaze cut through me as she looked down onto me. It may as well have been the end of the world, the way I felt as she stared at me. "This place is not yours," she reminded me. I swallowed hard. Sorry." She didn't say anything. She only stared. I was sweating. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The empty feeling swelled inside me. I felt like I was going to vomit. Just as I thought she might attack me, the atmosphere shifted slightly. It felt an invisible grip around my neck loosen a little. I enjoy nature, you know. I wish I could, stay here for, like, forever. I finally managed to stammer. "I see." She spoke softly again, and with that, she slid backwards into the dark of the twisted woods at ridiculous speed and disappeared. I was left stunned. The empty feeling only grew worse, now accompanied by a sudden sharp pain appearing in my stomach. I leaned over and dropped to my knees. Bile, or what I thought was bile, climbed up my throat. I closed my eyes and dry heaved. I did so several more times before I puked, the pain in my stomach ever present. When the pain receded slightly and I opened my eyes, expecting to see all the food I had eaten, I was shocked and scared to see a thick, vile black sludge. This was definitely wrong. 100%. Maybe Francis was right. I was starting to see where he was coming from. Where was he actually? "Francis!" I yelled out. Nothing. Oh God. "Francis!" I screamed. I was freaking out, panting and sweating, kneeling over my black vomit. I was beginning to lose hope. When I finally heard the bastard, far away, just about audible. "I'm pissing. Just wait." Oh, thank God. I didn't feel like standing up, so I waited until he came over, his faint footsteps drawing ever nearer. Oh God. Jesus Christ. He said once he laid eyes on me in the state I was in. As bad as his reaction was to hear, I was relieved to not be alone. "Hey man." Yeah, I spoke. Yet, when I looked up at him, something happened. I still don't quite know what. It was a blur. Everything stopped for a moment, and I felt like I saw a flash of red before I knew what had happened. I was where Francis was standing a moment ago, lying on my back. I looked around. Francis was gone. The sun had begun to set, and I was left confused as to what happened and where the time went. Francis had apparently left, and the whole ordeal left a bad taste in my mouth. Literally, a dry, tacky feeling and a terrible taste lingered in my mouth, most likely because I hadn't eaten all day. Yet, weirdly, I didn't feel hungry at all. I felt a little sick, in a kind of good way, if that makes sense. The empty feeling lingered still, but was dialed down to where I could ignore it. I was confused and frazzled that I decided not to overthink it. My eyelids felt heavy, and I decided to succumb to the feeling. I closed my eyes where I lay and fell asleep. I had a terrible nightmare that night, though it was dark, a void. I had no body, but I felt my body. In my mind I knew I was somewhere. Disembodied voices whispered all around me. They spoke to me all at once, telling me things I couldn't quite decipher. I felt the emptiness deep inside my very being twist and writhe as if it were living. It yearned for what? I didn't know, but it hungered for something. The cacophony of whispers grew in volume as I felt the swirling in my body. Millions of tiny legs clawed their way up my esophagus, ever so slowly. The whispers turned to pleading, and the pleading turned to begging. The millions of razor-sharp legs reached higher and higher, shredding my throat and mouth as they did. The begging became frantic. The tiny little legs reached my mouth and spilled out onto my chin. I couldn't breathe as they marched their way out, clogging my insides. The voices began desperately shouting. I still couldn't decipher the meaning behind their words. They screamed at me, screamed in rage, in ecstasy, in panic. The legs kept coming. There was a seemingly endless amount. The voices grew louder still. They seemed to sing in a demented choir, full of secrets I wasn't allowed to hear. Everything became more and more intense. The voices screamed louder. The legs crawled faster. My insides burned in pain, uncountable pinpricks littering every surface. I thought I might go deaf from how deranged and absurd the voices had become. Just when it seemed it couldn't get any worse, I was saved from the prison in my head and brought back to reality. I'm not sure if dreams hold meaning at all, but that one, it was so vivid, so debilitating. I gasped as I jolted awake, trying to brush it off as a typical nightmare. I was oh so hungry when I finally did. I was empty, you could say. I rose slowly, a sharp twang of pain from my stomach reminding me of my dream. I had to eat something. It was a long day of pain and hunger, searching the almost endless woodland for any form of sustenance. To be honest, I didn't even know it was this big, or how it was even possible. I foraged at first, eating anything I could get my hands on, berries, fungi, even bugs, but it didn't help ease the pain. Eventually, though, I stumbled upon a serene lake, its surface reflecting the sun right into my eyes. Hunger gnawed at my insides, a relentless beast that demanded to be satiated. I cast my gaze towards the tranquil waters and saw the shapes of fish swimming just below the surface. I knew I had to catch one. I had no tools to use and thought hard about what to do. When I remembered a trick my father taught me long ago, I gently placed my hand underwater, wiggling my thumb slowly. I waited and waited, moving ever so slightly as a few fish made their way over. And, confident as I was still surprised when it worked. As far-fetched as it sounds, a fish absent-mindedly bit my thumb, and I quickly grabbed it. Its face seemed comically shocked at the trap. But as I pulled the wriggling fish from the water, admiring its form, a primal urge took hold of me. The hunger was too intense. I tried to fight it, to resist the savage compulsion, but it was as if my very essence had become entwined with the instincts of the forest. It smelled heavenly, even raw, even live. I brought the fish closer to my face, its scales shimmering with an ethereal beauty. With a foggy mind and a sudden, violent motion, I bit down on its head, the crunch of bones and flesh filling the air as its head came clean off. I was stunned at myself for a moment, until I chewed and realized how delicious it was. It was probably the best thing I'd tasted, ever. I frantically shoved the rest of it in my mouth, the bones snapping and the shards scraping down my throat. I should have been horrified, repulsed by my own actions, but instead, an unsettling satisfaction washed over me. I spent the rest of the day devouring all of the fish I could find and only moved on to search for more food. Hours passed as I searched for food, then days. I lost track of time. Days turned into weeks as I wandered deeper into the woods, the landscape twisting and repeating in increasingly strange ways, the gnawing hunger persisting. But no matter how much I ate from the forest, it never seemed to satisfy me. It was as if the very essence of this place was draining me, consuming my humanity. As the time passed, I felt myself changing, transforming into something unrecognizable. My skin slowly took on a disturbing grayish hue, and my limbs twisted and elongated into gnarled branches. My once human thoughts had become entangled with the whispers of the forest, and I started to see the world through the eyes of the creatures that dwelled here. One evening, as the moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape, I came across a reflection in a dark puddle of water. What I saw, it was no longer the image of a man, but that of a monster, a creature born of the woods themselves. My eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and my body was covered in a mess of lichen and moss, but I didn't care. I still needed to eat. With each passing day, my connection to humanity fades further. The memories of my former life slip away like mist, and I am embracing my new existence. I move with the rhythms of the forest, frolic under the moonlight, my once much more human thoughts melding with the ancient knowledge of the forest. The trees whisper secrets to me, and I whisper back, their voices a chorus of rustling leaves and murmuring branches. I don't want to leave. I never did. But I can't find the trail out anyway. The outside world is becoming a distant memory, and I find solace in the quiet, ancient wisdom of the woods. I've carried the things I used to see as important with me, but the words on my phone are making less and less sense, so I think I'll leave it here. After all, the pain in my stomach, it's too much to ignore now. May 26th. My name is Fisher Jacobs. My mom said it would be helpful to write out my feelings on something and talk about significant events in my life. Mainly because I've been having issues with depression and suicidal thoughts. I think about it a lot. Too much, probably. I prefer to be alone most of the time. Sometimes I have trouble even being with my friends. My mom said I spend too much time in my room in the dark, so she took my curtains away. Sometimes I think she hates me. My dad is Bert Jacobs and my mom is Jennifer Jacobs. We live in a pretty nice house in the country. My dad owns about 100 acres of land. Half is a field and the other half is woods. The house is 2 stories, the whole upstairs being my bedroom, and I have a big window on one side overlooking the field. The basement is furnished and has a bedroom for guests, but it's basically my Uncle Jeremy's room. He lived with my grandmother until she passed away a year before. Ever since he's lived here with us. My mom told him he'd have to get a job and find his own place, but it hasn't happened yet. I turned 18 today. It was a fun birthday, being my first step into adulthood. May 27th. Last night my mom left the house sometime during the night without telling anyone. No one even heard her leave. Every morning my dad would wake me up early to go feed the chickens. As I walked out the back door, I noticed something white swaying in the tree line of the woods. I told my dad and we made our way back. But what I saw will forever be burned into my mind. It was my mom hanging by her neck, in nothing but her nightgown. June 10th. It's been exactly 2 weeks since she died. I see her pale face, devoid of life, in my dreams every night. The coroner said it must have happened around midnight. I think Dad is doing the worst. He hasn't really talked much since it happened, and he doesn't really leave his room unless he's going to work. He's stopped taking care of the farm, so I've been doing most of it. I had a really strange experience last night. I woke up in the middle of the night and felt drawn to my window. I looked out and could have sworn I could see someone standing out there in the field. The moonlight wasn't strong enough for me to properly tell, but it freaked me out a little. I just brushed it off and went back to bed. Although it was kind of hard to fall back to sleep, I kept feeling a weird anxiety about what I saw. June 17th. Last night I woke up in the middle of the night again. This time the motion sensor light we have on the back porch was on. So I got up and looked out the window and I saw something weird. It looked like someone was standing just outside of the light, but I still couldn't tell if I was just seeing things, but I swear it looked like someone was standing there. June 19th. I keep forgetting to write in this journal. I don't have too much happening in my life, but I've been thinking about my mom a lot recently. She was deeply in love with my dad. They had known each other since high school, and my mom always told me that she hoped to be with him in the afterlife, whatever it was. She was hard on Uncle Jeremy, but she just wanted him to do better because she loved him. He was her best friend. They told each other everything. I mean, hell, they're only a year apart in age. That's why I can't help but feel like I'm the reason she did it. We kept butting heads over everything. I just kept telling her I wanted to be independent and that I wanted to be left alone. She kept getting mad that I was going out and getting high with my friends instead of doing my homework and focusing on school. She just wanted me to get into a good college, have a good career, and be successful. But I just wanted to have fun. Mom, I'm sorry. I wish I listened to you. I'm sorry that I pushed you too far and made you so unhappy. I miss you. June 24th. Last night I went out with my friends for the first time in almost a month and stayed out until around midnight. When I got home, I circled the house to the back door so I didn't wake up my dad. Luckily for me, he usually leaves it unlocked for me so I can get in easier when I get home, in case I'm drunk or high. But as I rounded the corner of the house to the back porch, the porch light was already on, which I didn't really think twice about. But as I reached the door, all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned around instinctively. My heart dropped, my stomach twisted into a million knots, and I frowncy in place. I saw her. I saw my mom, but instead of the warm, comforting feeling I used to get, I felt like a fly in a spider web. She was standing in the light, motionless, wearing her white nightgown, but something was wrong. Her face didn't look right. It looked as though her skin had been removed, then stretched over her skull with her mouth looking as if it was being forced to smile, as if being held by hooks. Her eyes were pitch black, and it looked as if she had no eyelids. Her proportions were wrong as well, as if her arms had extra bones in them. As I sat there frouncing, she began to make a sound like a death rattle, but it was coming from her chest. She then forced out a word from her chest without moving her mouth. Fisher. I almost puked. It sounded like my mom, but something was wrong. Her voice sounded strained and hoarse. I instantly turned, opened the door and slammed it shut and screamed at the top of my lungs for my dad. He instantly came rushing in with the gun. He asked me if I was okay and what happened. I told him exactly what I saw. He looked out the window in disbelief, turned to me and said, "There's nothing out there, Fisher." I quickly shot up and looked, and he was right. There was nothing there. June 25th. My dad pulled some strings and got me in today for a psychological evaluation. I don't even believe what I saw myself, so I agreed to do it. They diagnosed me with schizophrenia and just prescribed me some medication, and that was it. We'll see if it works, I guess. June 27th. So far, I'd say the medication is working, I guess. I never had any previous episodes, so I don't know what it's meant to do. All I know is I haven't seen anything unnatural or strange since that night. July 1st. I woke up last night and the back porch light was on again. I looked out my window and she was there again. Except she was closer. She just stood there not doing anything. I pulled out my phone to get a picture, but when I looked through my phone she wasn't there. She disappeared. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have gotten so freaked out I fainted because I woke up this morning on the floor. July 8th. It happened again. I woke up randomly again. And yet again she was there, but this time she was staring directly at me. She changes what she does each time, seemingly. It feels like she's learning or something. I don't understand. She's been haunting me for weeks now. I don't get good sleep anymore. But I think I'm figuring her out at least a little bit. July 14th. I was in the basement playing video games with Jeremy tonight. It was fun. I felt comfortable, like everything was normal for the first time since Mom died. Then we heard a loud screeching noise. Jeremy brushed it off as a bobcat, which have terrifying cries and aren't uncommon around here. But it didn't sound right to me. It sounded strained and unnatural. We continued playing, and I noticed through the small window in the basement that the back porch light came on. I felt dread in the pit of my stomach. I jumped up and raced to the window and looked out, and I saw her. Only this time she was crawling around on all fours. I called Jeremy to come look. He groaned and nonchalantly walked over and looked out the window. "Dude, there's nothing out there. And you gotta stop going on like this about her. That's my sister and your mom. I know coping is hard, man, but we all just have to live with this. We all miss her." I ended up going back to my room. He wasn't going to believe me, and I'm beginning to feel like I am going insane. July 15th. This morning I woke up to Jeremy walking up the stairs to my room. He looked exhausted. He sat down at the end of my bed and put his face in his palms. "I saw her," he said. I asked him to tell me everything. "Right after you left, I turned on a show to watch to fall asleep to. I laid down on the couch and that's when I saw her. She was staring at me through the window in the basement, her eyes piercing through me. Her face was pressed against the glass like she really wanted inside or something. I've never been more scared in my life. I don't know how long she sat there and stared. I covered my face and she was gone. I immediately covered the window so she couldn't see me, and I hid in the bedroom all night waiting for something to happen. I didn't sleep. This honestly made me feel extreme relief. Knowing I'm not going crazy, Jeremy asked if he could sleep in my room for a few nights. I said yes, so we gathered blankets and pillows to make a makeshift bed for now. July 22nd. Last night, me and Jeremy both woke up at exactly the same time to another scream like the one from the other night. But this time, she wasn't out there staring up at us. We heard the back door open, and we both raced toward the stairs. When we got to the bottom, we could see my mom standing there with the back door open, smiling with her spine-chilling grin. She began making noise from her chest again, uttering "out Fisher," but this time it was followed by "let." "Me, in," she began repeating it. "Fisher, let, me, in." Captivated by fear, I was able to spit out the word "no." After which, she fell to all fours and began creeping backwards in a rigid manner, almost as if her limbs were frouncing. She continued backwards out of the light. It was only once she was out of view that we rushed toward the door and slammed it shut. Me and Jeremy went back to the room and must have passed out because we both woke up this morning on the floor of my bedroom. July 29th. When I woke up this morning, Jeremy was gone. I figured he might have just woken up early, but I asked my dad and he hadn't seen him. I searched the whole house and couldn't find him. My dad said he probably just left early to go do whatever it is that he does. Part of me wanted to believe my dad. The other part was sure something more sinister happened to him. August 5th. I woke up last night to sobbing outside. I walked over to the window and to my horror, there stood Jeremy, right next to his sister, except he was different. He had a horrifying frown instead of a grin like my mom. He was also hunched over as if his back was broken. They both looked directly at me and began moving towards my window. I sprinted back to my bed and covered myself with blankets and peeked out to look at my window. To my horror, they were both staring into my room, faces pressed against the glass. Then Jeremy croaked out Fisher, "Sorry, help," as my mom asked me to let her in again. I just Saturday there being tormented. I don't know how long, but as usual, I fell asleep at some point and woke up this morning. August 12th. I woke up 6 hours ago at the time of me writing this entry. When I woke up, I heard someone moving around in the house. I frowncy, but I realized it was my dad. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but I know he had his boots on. It meant he was about to go outside. I jumped down my stairs and looked toward the back door and saw my dad was already outside. I ran to the back door and screamed as loud as I could, "Dad, no." He didn't even turn around. All he said was, "Jenny, wait, please come back. I need you." I screamed for him as hard as I could, but he was already gone. I ran to his room and grabbed his gun, and as I stepped into the hallway to the back door, Jeremy was standing there. I aimed the gun with no hesitation and fired. It seemed to just go right through him like nothing. I dropped the gun and ran up to my room. I looked at my window and saw my mom, Jeremy, and now my dad. They were all talking at once, driving me insane. I grabbed the blanket off my bed and covered the window. Then I dropped to my knees and covered my face. Suddenly the voices stopped. I Saturday there like that for a while, but eventually I just Saturday on my bed staring at the blanket on the window for hours. The sun finally came up. It's 6:30 p.m. right now. I waited all day. I just took the blanket down and nothing was there. So I guess I'm alone now. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.